Good evening, everybody. The Music Fan is back bringing smiles to the faces, knowledge to the people, and most importantly, music to the masses. And I am back to continue my end of the year lists for 2021. So we've already taken a look at the top 50 consensus lists on albumoftheyear.org, as well as my favorite 50 songs of 2021. And we are very close to start diving into my top 50 list of the year. But before we do that, I gotta go over some honorable mentions, the ones that just missed the cut. So like last year, I'm gonna rapid fire 25 that missed the honorable mentions and then go over 25 honorable mentions. Couple rules, like every year I say. First off, this is my favorite albums. And just like with any album, I judge it on the whole. There might be some albums that have great songs that just didn't make the cut because the whole entire experience was not cohesive enough for me. Take, for example, the Self-Esteem album, where I talked about I Do This All the Time being one of my favorite songs of 2021, but the whole entire album kind of falling flat other than that. So just like with any sort of art, you wouldn't read one chapter of one book, you wouldn't watch one 5-minute scene for a movie. So this is my particular statement when it comes to albums. And second, and most importantly, I listened to 230 albums in 2021, but that doesn't mean I was able to listen to everything. There were still a few albums that I did not check out, some on purpose, some just because I didn't have the time. So for example, I didn't check out the new Drake album, didn't check out the new Justin Bieber album, didn't check out the new Ed Sheeran album, among others. So if there are certain albums that you don't see on this honorable mentions list, one, it could be that it just didn't make the cut of my honorable mentions, or two, it might be even higher on my list. There are a few other parts that are going to be coming out shortly, so don't despair if you don't see your particular album. It just might mean it might be a little bit higher, or I didn't get a chance to listen to it. Either way, let me know some of your favorite albums from 2021 as I go on with this list. Without further ado, here are 25 that just missed my honorable mentions, and we'll go through these in alphabetical order. These didn't make my cut, but they at least do deserve at least a listen. So we got Arm & Hammer with Haram, The Arms with Ultra Pop, Billie Eilish with Happier Than Ever, Black Dresses with Forever in Your Heart, Blues Traveler with their cover album Traveler's Blues, Clairo with Sling, Coldplay with Music of the Spheres, Deaf Heaven with Infinite Granite, Devin Townsend with 2 albums, The Puzzle and Snuggles, kind of a duo that I couldn't really take away from each other because they complement each other very well. We also have Fire Iron Frenzy with Until This Shakes Apart, Halsey with I Can't Have Love, I Want Power, Her with Back of My Mind, Imminence with Heaven in Hiding, Iron Maiden with Senjutsu, Japanese Breakfast with Jubilee, Jerry Cantrell with Brighton, King Gizzard with Butterfly 3000, The Mountain Goats with Dark in Here, Nick Cave and Warren Ellis with Carnage, Poppy with Flux, People Slicer with Mirrors, Steven Wilson with The Future Bites, The War on Drugs with I Don't Live Here Anymore, The Weather Station with Ignorance, and finally Zac Brown Band with the aptly titled album The Comeback. Check all these out. Don't really have a lot of time to talk about them, but they do deserve a listen. So now we have our honorable mentions, another 25. And just like with the last one, I will go in alphabetical order, but I will go with a little bit more in-depth on some of these. Spend about 30 seconds to a minute on each one of them. So first up, we have Adele with 30. I'm not the biggest Adele fan. I only really listen to her singles more than anything else. And although she's a beautiful singer, I just never really been able to get into her. This album, of course, has some very strong singles as well, with Easy on Me, easily one of her best songs that she's ever sung on, as well as Oh My God, which is just like a really fun and kind of trippy song for her. I can't really think of any other song that sounds like this in her catalog. And also there's just some really good depth on this album. There's a lot of use of more jazz approaches, more somber, soulful approaches. You know, not something that's necessarily out of her wheelhouse, But this one definitely has a little bit more of a personal touch with her being divorced from her husband after having her kid and being a single mother. There's a lot of just talking about that. And even though she says on the album that she doesn't really worry about being alone because she's always been fine with being alone, there are some very vulnerable moments on this album for her. So even though it's not the greatest particular set list, there are some stuff on the back end that I'm just not a huge fan of. This still definitely left a mark. If you haven't checked it out, which I'd be surprised at this point if you haven't, because it's basically been everywhere, do yourself a favor and check it out. Next, we have the Antlers with Green to Gold. This is my first dive into this band. I've heard of them before through Anthony Fantano, but this is my first time checking them out. I was honestly very surprised with the sound. It was very serene, very peaceful, very melancholy at times, but just honestly overall very beautiful. A Stubborn Man being a lovely song, as well as It Is What It Is, dealing with the idea of suicide and how it could be prevented, but just at this time it's dealing with life and being like it is what it is. Can't really go back and fix everything. You just got to keep moving on. Green to Gold is also just a really beautiful title track. There are some points where it is a little bit sleepy, but if you're looking for a very serene album, this is a good way of going. Next, we have Backwash with I Lie Here Buried With My Rings and My Dresses. This is a ghastly album in the best way possible. Their use of production and also their rapping gets you into a very interesting vibe. Even with the beginning with Purpose of Pain, which is this very hypnotic intro where they talk about the purpose of pain, and it keeps repeating on itself and getting faster, and it just sets this tone in the very weird and very ghastly way. Terror Packet is also just a hard-hitting song on this album. This one, I think if I got a couple more times with it, it probably would have made it closer to my top 50. But still, if this is like a particular vibe, if you're looking for some ghastly, not necessarily horrorcore rapping, but very industrial rap, this is a good way of going. Next up, we have Bandmade with Unseen World. This was a recommendation from Crash Thompson's YouTube channel, and I found this to be a lot of fun. Just heavy hitting hard rock, metal. Overall, this was a lot of fun, especially with a year where another Tricot album came out. Like, this one stood out a lot more to me with just its power and rawness. There is that language barrier that kind of pushes this down a little bit just because I can't really get connected with the lyrics, but hell of a lot of fun. And if you can get past, not necessarily understanding Japanese, you're gonna be good. All right, next up we have Black Veil Brides with The Phantom Tomorrow. Kind of along the lines of two of their three previous albums, The Wretched and the Divine, as well as Veil. This album is a rock opera base, and I will say this album kind of strays the line more of hard rock and arena rock than it does metal, but still they are on their form and they do great work with the material that they've created. Songs I particularly like on this album are Crimson Skies, which is a little bit of the harder, faster pace that you come from Black Veil Brides, as well as Kill the Hero, a little bit more arena-esque, but still a really fun song. And also Shadows Rise is one that goes on that faster side. So if you've been missing kind of their more heavier metal stuff with their first couple albums, this one has at least a little bit of a mixture of that hard rock and that metal. It's not necessarily topping The Wretched and the Divine, but it is still a really solid album, another solid outing from a great band. Next up, we have Bryce Dessner with the Australian String Quartet with Impermanence and Disintegration. This is a string quartet / dance piece. I haven't seen the dance part of it, and I would like to at some point. But if it is as good as the music written from Bryce Dessner and the Australian String Quartet, then it's going to be a hell of a show. Like, there's a lot of really solid and just beautiful string quartet pieces. And what's also really cool to me is there are some stuff in here that does stray away from the 4/4 pattern that's usually used in a lot of classical music. Stuff like Pulsing has this use of different time signatures that make it super interesting. And there's also some other parts where are just really, really tense and really rubato. Just an overall really interesting listen. And it's also really nice that they end up with a Knowingly cover, Another World, with a string arrangement. Haven't heard that song in a very long time, so it was really cool that they combined that on this particular album. Next up, we have Bullet for My Valentine with Bullet for My Valentine. Just like clockwork, where they put out a good album following it with a bad album, they have now gone back to putting out a good album. After the atrocity that Gravity was, this one kind of goes back to form and in a good way. Honestly, it's the hard hitting screen vocal approach that you've come to expect from this band from years past. Does it reach the heights of some of their better works like The Poison and Fever? Not necessarily, but it is a great comeback for them. There's a lot of really heavy hitting songs on here that I really like, including Paralyzed and Bastards. Bastards being a little bit more of that hard rock vibe, but it's still a very fun and catchy song. And Death by a Thousand Cuts is a pretty solid closer as well. Great comeback from this band. Just hope that it doesn't follow up with another lousy album. Next up, we have Chevelle with Neuratius. This I was a lot higher on at the beginning of the year. It was just really consistently good throughout the whole entire time. Yes, it doesn't really break away from the Chevelle formula that they've had over the last 2 decades, but it is still a really solid outing. Self-Destructor as well as So Long Mother Earth just like hit so hard, and I really love the beauty of Endlessly. It is, not necessarily a ballad, but it is the closest thing that you get to on this album. It just has a really grand size for it being a ballad. But there are also some parts on here that are kind of head scratchers, some of the interludes, as well as Lost in the Digital Woods. It just feels a little bit weird as an ending song. And then there are some songs on here that, are good, but just are solid. So I thought this was really going to make the top 50, but as I kept listening to more and more albums, I had to put this outside of there. But it still is warranted an honorable mention. It just goes to show how strong 2021 was when it came to music. Going from something a little bit dark and heavy to something a little bit more filled with sunshine and beauty, we have Common with A Beautiful Revolution Part 2. This is my first dive into Common, strangely enough, but it was a really fun one. There's just a lot of really beautiful and just really upbeat and happy arrangements. When We Move with Black Thought has just such great energy, as well as Get It Right. It's just filled with so much soul and a Motown vibe that is just so lovely to listen to. And honestly, this album is not that long. It's just a nice little palate cleanser for me for the year, with a lot of really conscious lyrics and a lot of hope for a better world for the African American race, as well as for the world in general. Just really upbeat, really nice to listen to. Definitely want to listen to part 1, because if part 1 is just as good as part 2, then I've definitely been missing out on a lot of Common. Next up, we have Evanescence with The Bitter Truth. This is another album that I really thought was going to make my top 50 in some way, shape, or form. I love a lot of this album. It just harkens back to just old school Evanescence with a little bit of that kind of EDM-ish electronic tinge that sometimes gets a little bit grating, but for the most part just really works with their formula. There was a lot of really catchy songs that, not necessarily the verses are catchy, but Amy Lee still knows them how to make a hell of a chorus. Feed in the Dark is phenomenal, just really rage filled about someone getting scorned and the revenge that this person will have on them. Far From Heaven is also a beautiful ballad, the only real ballad on this album, but still just really gorgeous and kind of goes in line with a lot of really great ballads that Amy Lee has written over the years. Use My Voice is kind of pop rock, but it still has a good message about the Me Too movement and not being silent through it. There's a lot of really good songs, but unfortunately, as my brother has pointed out to me, and as well as others have pointed out to me, that I can no longer deny as I've listened to it more and more, the production on here is not that great. Even on Feed in the Dark, which is my favorite song, there's a lot of parts on here that kind of just feel out of balance, especially where it sounds like there's supposed to be a guitar solo at one point, but just never really shows up in the mix. I would hope that I can chalk this up to it being released during the pandemic and maybe not everyone being together to put this together, but still, I cannot deny that when you have production issues like this, even with an album that has a lot of really good songs, but not necessarily great songs, it's going to hurt it in the end. It's still really fun, and if you love Evanescence, definitely check it out. It's worth your time. Just, it was a little bit behind on being in my top 50. Next up, we have J. Cole with The Off Season. I have really liked J. Cole over the last few albums, and this one is no different. This one hits really hard at times, and J. Cole just shows off how he's still a really great lyricist. The one that really comes to mind for me is The Climb Back, which is taking a look at different paths through people's lives and how some people can get through life and others kind of make excuses for not being able to get through life. Close is also a really interesting song with a really interesting story about how like a close friend turns out to be an enemy at one point. There's Let Go My Hand, where he is talking about how his son looks at him and how he needs to be there for his son even as he's growing older. There's a lot of really solid work, but not necessarily anything that like stands head and shoulders above some of the other stuff in this top 50. So unfortunately, even though it's a good album and I'm really happy that it's up there for Rap Album of the Year for the Grammys, it just missed my cut, but still hell of an album. Next up, we have Jetty Bones with Push Back. This is a very interesting album. Another one that I found through Crash Thompson's channel. This one has a lot of different vibes. Sometimes it's a little bit more like Paramore. Sometimes it has a little bit of country flair. Sometimes it reminds me of Kesha. And actually, I think Kesha would probably be the best person to kind of compare her with, just because of the diversity that is shown on this album. The cool thing about Jetty Bones is, even though this is a very short album, there's so much diversity on this album. One of my favorite songs, Taking Up Space, is a kind of like acoustic-y pop ballad that is honestly gorgeous and shows off her great singing voice. You have Dolly, which is a really fun, tongue-in-cheek, kind of twisted song about not wanting to be in this world anymore and not wanting to make any sort of commitments to people because it would be harder to say goodbye to them. Bug Life is a really beautiful and sobering closer about still wanting to be alive. The other thing about this is like one of the more, not necessarily twisted albums I've listened to all year. That's not the right term, but it's one of the more depressing albums that I've heard all year, because each one of these songs is talking about dealing with depression, anxiety, losing people, being on the verge of suicide, all in a very tasteful way. If talking about suicide can be tasteful, this is her dealing with her own demons. It's interesting because just like with After Laughter a few years ago, this one is talking about depression and anxiety and all these thoughts in a very upbeat way a lot of the time, almost kind of making fun of it at times, but it's trying to find a way of happiness through the sadness. So there are some songs on here that I don't really find interesting, and there's also, it just kind of like goes by really quickly as an album, but it's still one of the more interesting albums that I listened to all year, so definitely check it out. All right, from something that's a little bit all over the place when it comes to its sound to something a little bit more uniform and kind of familiar, you have John Mayer with Sob Rock. This album doesn't necessarily show off his guitar licks, nor does it really push the envelope when it comes to him. But this is just like a really nice and nostalgic album, if you will. There's a lot of 80s vibe in this, a lot of 80s rock vibe. Honestly, it kind of reminds me of some of Eric Clapton's work in the 80s. It's got a lot of that nostalgic and kind of heartwarming vibe at times, even if he is talking about some sadder stuff. It shouldn't matter, but it does. Falling in love with somebody and it's not really meaning anything, and not wanting to feel hurt, but still feeling hurt either way. Why You No Love Me, which is, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but again, it's another one of like feeling sad because someone that you care about doesn't love you back. I guess I Just Feel Like is definitely the most depressing song and kind of most simplistic song on the album. Definitely kind of just classic rock vibe about just like the thoughts in his head, his depressive thoughts in his head. But there's also some stuff on here that is kind of uplifting in a like a fuck you kind of way of time. Like The Right One Comes, where he's like holding out on hope and not pushing himself to put in a relationship that he doesn't want to be in because it's just some random person. It's a really catchy song. You've definitely heard that vibe before, but it's really nice. Also, really love Last Train Home. It's a beginning song, really upbeat, just great melody. And then New Light, which is definitely the most 80s tinged on the album, but another one that has just a really nice beat and a really nice guitar line. Just a lot of fun overall, and it doesn't have a lot of substance, but it just fills that particular niche that you're looking for. Next up, we have JPEG Mafia with LP. My second or third dive into JPEG, and I will say this is probably the one that sticks the most to me. And I think it's just because the production on here is really, really good at times. Very interesting and makes me want to just listen back just for the particular production. Bear in mind, I also just listened to the Spotify one. I know that there's another one floating around that's a little bit different, so I can't really talk about that one. But on here, there's a lot of really just interesting songs, and there are a lot of times on here that his inflection, his over-the-top personality definitely shows through and makes for some interesting songs. I really like end credits. I know that they use a Animals as Leaders sample on there, which is really cool to me. I also kind of dig Thought's Prayer using an interpolation of Hit Me Baby One More Time by Britney Spears. Sick, Nervous, and Broke is honestly JPEG at one of his more deranged and more angry, which comes off really interesting. And then the Bald and Bald remixes sound really good, especially when on Bald remix you have Denzel Curry joining him. But other than that, there isn't like a lot of raps on here that kind of stand out to me, and that's why it doesn't make my top 50. I really appreciate the production, but his rapping style is still something that leaves a little bit to be desired in terms of my opinion. Next up, we have King Gizzard with LW, the other King Gizzard album that dropped in 2021, because of course it can't be a year unless King Gizzard drops at least 2 albums. This was a continuation of a project from 2020, KG, which also used micro-tuning. This particular album is a little bit more on the heavier side, though there is some kind of Middle Eastern vibes as well on here, and on the lighter side sometimes. My favorite song on the album is Plura, which just has this really interesting, really grimy sound. I like the interplay of the voices on that particular song and the contrasting of heavy verses and light choruses. One is also a really solid song, as well as Ataraxia and Supreme Ascendancy. But there are some songs in here that kind of just feel very similar, and KGLW as a grand closer for this project just feels a little bit too sludgy arena rock for me. Still really fun. I need to check out the rest of King Gizzard because there's so much out there that just sounds super interesting to check out. Next up, we have Leon Bridges with Gold Digger Sound. This album, to me, just was very interesting. For me, this was very lo-fi or low-key in terms of the Leon Bridges that I have grown to know. Very much in a pocket, very smooth, and very minimalist at times, but of course having some parts where the layers shine through, like on Magnolias with the beautiful horn lines accompanying his vocals. There's also a beautiful and painful song, Why Don't You Touch Me, talking about a love falling apart, and even though she's looking for other people, he's right there right now, so why don't you hold me, why don't you show me that you love me. A lot of really beautiful songs on this album. It literally just missed the top 50. It's that good. If you haven't checked this one out, you're sleeping on it. Leon Bridges has been killing it over the years, and this is no exception. Next up, we have Low with Hey What. I kind of talked a little bit about this in the consensus top 50, so I'm not really going to go much in depth. I found a lot of the soundscapes on this album very interesting to listen to, and I really enjoy how a lot of these songs bleed over into the next one. But for me, this one, as good as it is, isn't as good as Double Negative. To me, that one has a little bit more staying power. This one just kind of is a more of an experience of a whole rather than one particular song. Still not a bad album. As I've listened to it more and more, I enjoyed it more, and if I listened to it a little bit more times, maybe it could have made my top 50, but at this point it just misses that cut. Next up, we have Olivia Rodrigo with Sour. This also at one point was pretty close to making my top 50, and it honestly isn't that far away from it. I do really enjoy the songwriting on this album, and even though it is from the perspective of someone younger as well as someone who is going through probably their first few breakups and heartbreaks, there's still a lot of very poignant songs on here. Favorite Crime is a gorgeous song about maybe missing this person, but at the same time still happy that they got the chance to be with this person, being accomplice to all the love that they had. Deja Vu is also a heartbreaking song about this person that they loved is now with somebody else and is teaching and doing the same things that they had done as a couple, but is now taking a lot of things that they had learned from their partner and teaching it to this new partner, and seeing like, yeah, I could have been me. I could have been the one being there for this person. Driver's License, also a really heartbreaking song. There's also Good For You, just a really good fuck you song. There's a lot of really good stuff on here. There's a lot of really good death on this album as well. Just in terms of the pop stuff that I've listened to this year, it doesn't make the cut for me, but it is pretty damn close. Even though it is written by a teenager, that's no reason not to listen to it. It is still a pretty solid pop album. Next up, we have Rise Against with Nowhere Generation. This is a Rise Against album, let's be honest. There isn't going to be a lot of difference between this and other albums, but they are still doing what they've been doing for years in a really good way. They haven't really made a bad album in quite some time, and this is no different. There's still a lot of really good and very powerful songs about fighting the powers that be and taking down capitalism and everything like that. Particular songs I really enjoy: Don't Nowhere Generation, Talking to Ourselves, Sooner or Later is a really good song about the brevity of life, and Rules of Play as a closer is just killer as well. Again, it's not necessarily an album that you're going to put on and be like, oh my god, this is incredible, but it's an album that is very serviceable from a very solid band. Next up, we have Ross Jennings with A Shadow of My Future Self. This was an album that once I heard that it was coming out, I was really excited about. Ross Jennings has been the lead singer of one of my favorite current prog bands, Haken, and he also did a great job as a dual vocalist on Novena in 2020. So with a band and a mind like that, I was very curious to see how a debut solo album from him would go. And it kind of was a mixed bag. There's definitely some really good songs on here. Phoenix is a very powerful song, lasting almost 12 minutes, something that you would expect from a prog singer. You also have Better Times being a beautiful folk proggy intro song. Violet being this really weird and trippy 80s vibe song that has just like really weird vocals at times, but I really enjoyed the chorus and it just is super catchy to me, as well as Year being a beautiful closer, and Since That Day being a very powerful song about the days after someone committed suicide and how it affected everybody, especially in a little town. And also Catcher in the Rye is a beautiful prog rock ballad about hoping that someone that they care about is still doing well, even though they haven't seen this person in years. There's a lot of really solid songs, but there's also some, not necessarily head scratchers, but some more mainstream ideas that just don't really pan out, in my opinion, in terms of his voice. The one that really stands out to me is Feeling. It's definitely one of the more mainstream songs, and it just feels really weird in his voice, singing something so simple as that. Rocket Science is also just kind of really nerdy, and that's coming from someone who really loves prog music. Just the idea of explaining that love is not rocket science. Overall, it doesn't really do much for me. The Apologist also is just kind of a song that is meh. To me, there's a lot of really solid ideas throughout this, and it feels like him trying to do something more along the lines of, say, a Peter Gabriel or a Phil Collins, trying to do his approach to a 80s style solo record, and it works at times, but other times it kind of just feels a little bit too cheesy. Still a really solid first outing from Ross Jennings. I would love to see some more work in solo And I, of course, can't wait to hear a new Haken album from him. Next up, we have Sons of Kemet with Black to the Future. The first album that I listened to them, Your Queen is a Reptile, was really interesting and had some really cool stylistic ideas, basically making a song for certain women who have had some very pivotal roles in history, even though they don't get their shine when it comes to the history books. It's really cool to hear the different ideas that came out of that, though I will say it was a little bit one note at times. I think that this one is a little bit better when it comes to diversity, but also it does suffer from sometimes being a little bit too simplistic and a little bit more mainstream, like Hustle. But there's also some songs on here that are absolutely gorgeous. The last few songs on the album, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, Envision Yourself Levitating, and Throughout the Madness, Stay Strong, really killer songs. There's also some really solid spoken word from Joshua Idahin on both the intro and the outro songs. So, still a memorable album. This is literally the one that just missed the cut in terms of it being in the top 50. It was the OLI, the outside looking in. Make no mistake, this is still a really solid album from a really solid band. Definitely check them out, especially if you didn't check out Your Queen is a Reptile. Next up, we have Squid with Big Green Field. This was a really solid year for post-punk for me. There's definitely two that made my top 50 and pretty high in. And this wasn't that far behind. I did like a lot of the zaniness of this album. Starting off with GSK as a opener for this album, kind of really just taps into the zany energy and a lot of the polyrhythms on here that just are so really interesting to listen to. I really, really enjoy Pamphlets as a closing song. It was one of my top 50 songs of the year. A song that like is 8 minutes long, but the ride is really zany and just really builds so well in terms of energy and layering of parts. There's some really fascinating ideas on this album, but there are also some times where I just don't really find the appeal of it. Like in the middle of Narrator for me, there are some moments where it just doesn't really click, as well as Boy Racers. I find the middle of that just like kind of lackluster. And there are some slower parts on here that just don't really set that same energy for me as the really zany and hectic fast paced parts. But still really cool debut album from this band. Found out that they had a concert in my town a few weeks ago. I just didn't have the time to go see it, but I would love to see it because I saw a live version of them and their stuff looks killer live. So maybe next time around, and who knows, maybe the next album from them will be just as good, if not better. All right, 3 more to end my honorable mentions. Next up, we have St. Vincent with Daddy's Home. This one, I really enjoy the narrative on here. I really enjoy the callbacks to more classic rock, specifically kind of psychedelic rock at times, with the use of sitar. There's some really kind of zany and memorable songs on his album. Pay Your Way in Pain, that feels very much like the culmination of like a 3-day bender as you are still staggering through the streets trying to find your way home. Daddy's Home, a kind of burlesque-ish kind of theatrical song about her talking about her father. I also really enjoy At the Holiday Party, a more classic rock kind of Joni Mitchell kind of sound. A beautiful song about someone hiding their pain in front of everybody, but someone else being able to see it. The culmination of this album is really interesting, and I do enjoy the story, but there are some songs on here like Living the Dream or My Baby Wants a Baby that just doesn't really work for me. So even though it's not in my top 50, I do definitely see the appeal of this album, and definitely check this out if you haven't and honestly love St. Vincent. Next up, we got Tribulation with Where the Gloom Becomes Sound. This one is a really interesting metal album. It definitely has that cheese factor that both is a plus and a minus in my book. The plus is with a lot of really good guitar work and the scream vocals being really interesting to listen to at times. But the minus is sometimes it just gets a little bit too over the top with its subject material or the vocals, that even though I like the arrangements, it just gets kind of grating on me and I just start kind of laughing. Fun experience. I'm glad that I finally checked out Tribulation because a couple people were telling me about it. It didn't necessarily hit my top 50, but it didn't really disappoint me either. Finally, to end my honorable mentions, we have Wolf Alice with Blue Weekend. Kind of already talked about this one as well in the consensus top 50 list. This album starts off really well and honestly has a really good diverse track list throughout the whole. Delicious Things having this kind of Lana Del Rey-esque vibe, but also having a lot of atmospheric choruses. Lipstick on the Glass also kind of keeping that Lana Del Rey vibe, but also being a little bit more poppy. Smile having a 90s glamish tinge that reminds me of stuff like Garbage and like Hanson, bathed in that 90s tinge, which is just sounds so lovely. And Safe from a Heartbreak If You Never Fall in Love is a beautiful, short and simple ballad about keeping yourself safe from heartbreak because someone else is fucked up. This album starts really well, and even Play the Greatest Hits with this really fun and zany kind of punk-ish song about just wanting to always hear the greatest hits. It starts really well. I will say it kind of tails off at the end for me, but this was a great first listen from this band, and if this was a little bit more cohesive and just a little bit more consistent on the end, this definitely would have made the top 50. So there you have it. There are my 25 honorable mentions and even my 25 honorable mentions. I hope you found a lot of really good material in there. If you have, definitely tell me what your favorites are and just in general what your favorite albums from 2021 were. Also give this video a like if you enjoyed anything of what I said, and also most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. That way I know that you enjoy what I'm doing and want to see more videos like this in the future, because I still have a few more up my sleeve for this 2021 list. So coming up next will be the start of my top 50, and we'll be going over albums 50 through 41. Till then, this is the Music Fan, and I'm signing off.